Suppose that the federal government purchased $50 million worth of space shuttles and parts and so on. What we would have is, here's the components of aggregate demand. So government spending rises by 50, right? So aggregate demand would rise by 50. So here's our graph, long-run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate demand, or aggregate supply. So we've got a shift in the aggregate demand curve out to the right. Now here's the question. How much would aggregate demand shift? Would it be this amount, the 50, okay, here? That's we drawn it. Or would it be more than 50? Or would it be less than 50? Okay, this spending here could result in aggregate demand shifting by more or less. So maybe it's 100, maybe it's only 25. Okay, what is it? Well, this is where things get interesting because there are two effects here going on. There's a reason why it could be more than 50 and a reason why it would be less than 50. We're going to talk about why it would be more than 50 first of all, and that is called the multiplier effect. Okay, now if you look back at the when we talked about the simple money multiplier, back when we talked about the banking system and the multiple deposit creation, that is very similar to what we're going to do here. Okay, so a multiplier's effect says that when the shuttle contractors get more orders, okay, well, let me write that down. Shuttle contractors, they get more orders. So the government's purchasing from them. Profits would rise. Stock prices of the companies involved would rise. Workers' income would rise. Okay, so all that going on, what's going to happen? The result is consumption would go up. Okay, people would buy new cars, they'd do some traveling, and they'd go out to eat, eating out, all that, okay? But it doesn't stop there. Then there's a second round. Car dealers, their sales go up. Income rises, and their employees get more money, right? They're better off. And then they go out and eat. Eat out, travel, and buy more stuff, okay? And then it keeps on going. And that spending is received as income and is then spent. And then that spending is received as income and part of that spent. Okay, so you can see where we're going with this. This goes round after round after round. And also, as firms that are seeing an increase in demand for their products may want to add to their production capabilities. So this demand spurred on by this increased consumption, and firms may need to increase their production. And so investment is going to rise. This is called the an investment accelerator. So the feedback from the demand is increasing investment, and firms increase their investment capabilities because they're seeing this new demand. Well, how big is this multiplier? Okay, round after round. We've got a multiple. So what we're going to see is not just the 50 million, but a multiple of 50 million, because there are various succeeding rounds of spending. Well, it all depends, the size of the multiplier all depends on something that's called the marginal propensity to consume. We're going to call it the MPC for short. The marginal propensity to consume is simply the change in consumption divided by the change in income. Remember, Y is income. We can't use I because I is investment. So Y is income. Well, so for example, if you earn an extra $100, let's say your change in income equals 100, and you save 20, what's your marginal propensity to consume? Well, you're saving 20%, so you're spending the rest, which is 80%. So the change in income is 100. The change in consumption is, how much are you consuming? Well, if you're saving 20 of that 100, you're spending the rest. So your change in consumption is 80. So your marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. So in other words, you're spending 80% of what you make. Well, with a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, we can follow this multiplier. We can kind of trace it down. So let's say that the change in government spending is 50. Okay? So that's the first round. Government spends 50. The second round, well, people receive that 50 as income. Well, let me put that over here. People receive that $50 as income, but then only spend 0.8 of it. And so the second round of spending would be 40. And then that would be received as income, and then part of it saved, 80% of it spent. So the next round would be 32 in spending. And then the fourth round, that 32 is received as income, 20% of it saved, 80% of it spent, and that is 25.6 is being spent. So what we've got, and we can just keep on going. So we got the 50, the first round, 40, second, 32, and we just keep adding and adding. We could go 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, round after round after round after round. So another way to write this is we have 50, the first round, then 50 times, the second round is 50 times the marginal propensity to consume. And then the third round is 50 times the marginal propensity to consume times the marginal propensity to consume. And then the next round is 50 times the marginal propensity to consume times the marginal propensity to consume times the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, you get the idea. Now, we can factor out the 50s. Factor out those 50s, and then we've got, 1 plus, 1 plus marginal propensity to consume, okay, plus the marginal propensity to consume squared. See, we got that. Plus, so we've got 2 marginal propensity, that's a squared. Then we got it 3 times marginal propensity to consume to the third. And if we keep on going, MPC to the fourth plus MPC to the fifth, and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. This is called an infinite series. And what we, unfortunately, will converge to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. As you can remember back to the banking system, multiple deposit creation, and the simple money multiplier, that looks very similar process. So our multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.8 equals 5. So that initial change in government spending of 50 million will, through the multiplying each multiple round of spending, will grow to 50 times the multiplier equals 250. So if we draw this out, aggregate demand, here we have it shifting out by, put aggregate demand prime, initially shifting out by 50. That's a distance of 50. But through the multiplier effect, it's going to go out another 200 for a total of 250. The shift is going to be 250. So, when implementing fiscal policy, obviously you've got to know what the multiplier is, or have a pretty good estimate. You're going to want to know what it is. Because if your goal is to shift aggregate demand out by 50, let's say that's your objective, and you were to increase government spending by 50, you're going to get way more than 50. You're going to get 250. So you're going to overstimulate the economy big time. So we've got to know what that marginal propensity to consume is. So, and what this multiplier force is all about. Now this multiplier, now obviously government needs to consider this when implementing the spending portion of fiscal policy, but also this happens with investment. When investment spending takes place, the multiplier takes place there too. Because each level of, okay, let's say instead of the government increasing spending by 50 million, let's say that Apple Computer decides to build a new factory and it spends 50 million. That same multiplier, it works exactly the same way under the investment heading. So this goes up by 50, but through the multiplier ends up 250 as well. And the same with net exports. Net exports, if there's an economic boom in Europe and they start to buy because they're more rich and they're spending money and they're going to buy some of our exports, we're going to see the same multiplier effect through net exports. So if net exports rises by 50 million, that's going to be multiplied through the economy times the multiplier, and actually end up being 250 million. So this isn't just through government spending, it's through any of the components of aggregate demand this multiplier effect is something that needs to be considered. Now, the reason why that possibly the 50 million would result in less than 50 in aggregate demand. Okay, crowding out. Going back, okay, government spends 50 million more. We just talked about why aggregate demand would shift by more than 50 million through the multiplier effect. Now we're going to talk about why that 50 million would be less than. So aggregate demand would be maybe 25. So government spends 50, aggregate demand shifts by less than that. Well, that's possible via something called crowding out. Now, how this works is, okay, government spending goes up. And that means income goes up. Okay, people are going to receive that spending as income. That's going to rise. And because of the increase in income, consumption's going to go up. And what do you need to consume? Okay, you need money. So there's going to be an increase demand for money. Demand for money. Let me write that out. If we spend more, we're going to have more money. So this increase in consumption requires more money with which to complete our purchasing transactions. So what that's going to look like, here's our money supply curve again with the liquidity preference model. Here's the money demand curve. Here's the interest rate. Increase in money demand does what? It will increase the interest rate. And then what happens? Well, let's write this. Interest rate goes up and investment goes down. Okay, so, well, let me put that over here. So we've got government increase their spending, income goes up, which is going, and people are going to spend some of that income. But to do that, they're going to demand money. Money demand's going to go up. So we have the money demand curve shifting out, interest rates going up, and then interest rates rising and capital investment falling. So we've got two things happening here. We've got consumption going up and investment going down. What's going to be the net result? Well, if it's this investment going down, if that's the case, we're going to have maybe less aggregate demand shift than we do initially, that increase in government spending. So what is the net effect of crowding out? We've got consumption going up, we've got investment going down. So aggregate demand goes where? Up or down? Well, or less than consumption or less than investment. So which way does it go? So if the economy is in a recession, it's likely to go up. It's going to go this way because we've got unused capacity during a recession, and this is not going to crowd out investment. Okay, but if we're in an expansion, well, there isn't really any unused capacity, so any increase in government spending may very well indeed this may be the overpowering part, and aggregate demand would go up by less than government spending. So it really comes down to, if we're in a recession, we've got unused capacity, crowding out, it's not going to be an issue. If we're fully employed and the economy is booming along, crowding out is more likely to be an issue in that case. So there we have fiscal policy in the form of government spending, changing government spending. Now we're going to look at the other tool of fiscal policy, taxes. So the federal government can also stimulate or slow the economy by, lowering or raising taxes. So how this works is if taxes go down, that gives people more of their money to spend, and they can spend more money. Consumption goes up, aggregate demand goes up. Or if they increase taxes, that gives people less of their money to spend, and consumption falls, and aggregate demand falls. By, of course, the multiplier and the crowding out effects are present here as well. So anytime you see a change in consumption or capital investment, the multiplier is going to be in effect. It'll be in effect just like before. So here we go. Let's have the taxes go down. If taxes go down, then we've got consumption going up, and then we've got aggregate demand going up, but also income, because income's going up, money demand is going up. That means interest rates are going up, which means investment is going down. So aggregate demand is going down. So via the multiplier effect, we've got this and this. So which ways it's going to go? Well, that depends on how big of an issue crowding out is. So depending on the relative size of the multiplier and crowding out effects, the change in aggregate demand can be larger or smaller than the tax change that caused it. A tax cut or increase, the effectiveness will depend largely on whether it's a permanent or a temporary tax change. If the tax change is viewed as permanent, it's going to have a bigger impact because people are going to see this as a permanent change in their income, whether it's higher or lower. And they're going to respond a lot more to a permanent change than when the change is viewed as just temporary. If it's a temporary tax change, people are going to not change their behavior much at all. They're just going to bite the bullet and keep doing things as they normally do. A great example, a couple of examples. Back in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson, he was ramping up the Vietnam War, and he also had a lot of spending on the war, but he was also had all these great society programs, social programs. So Johnson was spending like a maniac, frankly, and the economy was heating up. There was a fear of inflation, rightfully so. That's we started our inflationary problems, and on through the 70s, we've already talked about that. So what they tried to do was slow aggregate demand by raising taxes. Well, raising taxes is not very politically popular. And a president's raising taxes, he wants to get reelected, is going to have a tough time with that. No president really wants to raise taxes. But the idea was to, here's the aggregate demand, shifting out like crazy, and then we've got these inflationary problems with the price level rising, and they want to restrain that. They want to bring it back the other way. They want to hold on. So raise taxes, right? If you raise taxes, a tax increase means consumer spending will fall. And thus, aggregate demand will fall. Well, what they did was they implemented a one-time tax surcharge. I think it was 10%. So, one time. Well, everybody knew it was one time. So what happened to aggregate demand? Pretty much nothing. Okay, they did not cut their consumption much at all. They just bit the bullet for this one-time tax surcharge. Now, if this has been a permanent change, that would have changed behavior much more so than it did. Another example took place in 1992, the Bush administration, the Big George, trying to stimulate the economy. So what they wanted to do was lower taxes. If they lower taxes, consumption would go up, and aggregate demand would go up. So the idea here, again, was to shift aggregate demand to the right. Well, they didn't even cut taxes. All they did was they reduced withholding. Okay? They reduced withholding. So you still owed the same amount of taxes. So they were hoping that they let people have less of their money withheld out of their checks, that they'd go and spend it. They go and spend. Well, come on. Are you really going to increase your consumption if you're going to have to pay the same amount of taxes? So all you've got to do, you've have less withheld, but you know in a few months you're going to have to come up with that money to pay your taxes. So are you really going to increase consumption? Well, no, you're not, and they didn't. What it amounted to was just a short-term loan or whatever that you had to pay back in just a matter of months. So that was another temporary, extremely temporary. That wasn't even a change in taxes, just a change in withholding. That didn't do anything at all. We've talked about fiscal policy and how it works. It's pretty simple, really. It's just a matter of increasing or decreasing government spending, trying to manage aggregate demand. If you want to shift aggregate demand to the right, if you want to juice the economy, you increase spending. If you want to restrain the economy, you decrease spending. Or you can do it through taxes. If you want to stimulate the economy, you can lower taxes, and that will increase consumption. If you want to restrain the economy, you raise taxes. That will decrease consumption. So, that's how it works. Now we're going to talk about the case, then that's called stabilization policy, when you're trying to stabilize the economy through managing aggregate demand. Now, the case for stabilization policy, before 1946, when the Employment Act of 1946 was passed, they had an explicit goal that the government should promote full employment and production. Okay? Prior to 1946, really economics was just not a function of government. The government was supposed to stay out of that stuff. That was up to private individuals. That was their business, how they made a living, and government was not to interfere with that. Well, after the Great Depression, which was actually ironically brought on by the Federal Reserve Bank and an arm within the government, it was determined that the government really should get involved, at least somewhat, okay? So now they had kind of the legal and moral authority to be involved. So to promote a stable economy, full employment and production. So here are the implications. One, if government's going to get involved, they should do no harm. Okay, just kind of like the Hippocratic Oath for physicians. Do no harm. Okay, you don't want a patient coming to you who's worse off because they did, right? So do no harm. Do not be the cause of fluctuations. Okay? And the idea is to use counter-cyclical policy to stabilize the economy. Whoops. Okay, how that works. Okay, here's our long run. Here's time, here's GDP. Here's our long run GDP. Long run sustainable GDP. And we've got recessions and expansions. So here's what you do. If we've got an expansion, if we're booming up here, the idea is to try to squish that back down to here. Okay, so if we're getting out of control, what would we do in this case? Well, to bring this down here, we would, using fiscal policy, we would reduce government spending. We could raise taxes. Okay. That would be fiscal policy. How about monetary policy? Reduce the money supply. Okay. Reduce the money supply, and that will raise interest rates and reduce investment. So you can do that. Or, you know, when you're down here below the long run sustainable growth, we want to build that up. We want to prop that up there. Okay? What would you do there? Well, you would increase government spending, could lower taxes, and increase the money supply on monetary policy. So here we've got the fiscal policy levers here, government spending and taxation, and then the monetary policy increase or decrease the money supply. Again, keep in mind they do that through open market operations with the federal funds rate as their target. Okay, here's the problem. That's what they're supposed to do. That's the idea. Now, John Maynard Keynes came up with all this in the Great Depression. He saw a need to increase government spending and increase it a lot. And his idea was to increase government spending, borrow money, okay, to get us back up here. And then when you're up in the expansion, use those tax revenues from the expansion to pay off the debt here. So to increase government spending, you're going to have to borrow money. You go into debt, stimulate the economy, get it out of the recession, and then here you would pay the debt back. Well, this became rather intoxicating. And at the time of the Kennedy tax cut, which you saw the video on, it was a perfect textbook case of Keynesian economics in action. But then they started to go to the well too often, trying to fine-tune the economy. And there's also another problem. So Keynes is being, I think, unfairly blamed for all these large deficits because his idea was to pay it back. Borrow here, pay it back here. But his disciples never pay it back. Okay, they want to just keep on going, and the second it slows down, they stimulate it some more. So the money never gets paid back, and we just keep getting bigger and bigger debt. So you can't really blame Keynes for that, I don't think. He saw it as something you do, not really to fine-tune the economy, but in times of great disaster, like the Great Depression, not as an ongoing way to manage the economy. So anyway, that's one of the problems. The big problem here with fiscal policy is this in practice never happens. Okay, and this not so much. In practice, when the economy needs to be restrained, politicians aren't going to want to do it. They just aren't going to want to do it. That's why during the internet boom, of course, Bill Clinton, like any president, this is the nature of politicians, he was taking the credit for it. And, really in practice, I don't know how much he had to do with the internet development and technology and so forth, but you know what? He was president, he took credit, that's the way it goes. Presidents take credit for anything that happens, and they get the blame for anything that happens. Whether they deserve one or the other, that's just the way it is. So, naturally, being a good politician, he was taking credit for this. The last thing he wanted was to slow the economy down before the next election. He wasn't going to run, but he was done. He's in the second term, but he wanted his legacy to be that the economy boomed like crazy, under him. And politicians just don't want to slow down the economy on their watch. They don't. And so, in practice, fiscal policy doesn't really get implemented to slow down the economy. It could, but they don't. They don't do it. So that's left to the Federal Reserve Bank. And that's why the Federal Reserve Bank is independent. That's why you don't want politicians to have much oversight over the Federal Reserve Bank. I know this frustrates politicians a great deal. And there's a movement now for politicians to have a greater input. And we don't want that. We don't want that. The money supply is too important to be politicized. So Alan Greenspan, basically back at that time, was the adult in the room, if you will. They had to, they started to do this, and then the arguments, we talked about that before, the arguments to not do it won the day, and it turned out to be the right argument. Don't do anything. Let the economy go along. It was a unique period with new technology that was shifting that long-run aggregate supply curve out to the right a great deal. So you can't count on fiscal policy to do this. The politics won't really allow it. Here you can. Okay, here you're going to get this and you're going to get this. So no problem there. So everybody's on board with trying to stimulate. But there's also a problem with timing. Here's the issue with timing. Stabilization policy, yes. Let's restrict, let's do this. Let's do this. But by how much? Okay, how much do you do it? How much, so let's go over here. How much do you expand government spending to do this? How much do you cut taxes? How much do you increase the money supply? Shift that money demand curve. How much do interest rates go down? If you do it too much, remember one of the purposes of stabilization, or one of the purposes, reasons for government to be involved, is to make things better, right? Not to make things worse. So if you do too much of this, you can actually make the cycle worse. You can come out of the recession, go way up here. Oops, slam on the brakes. So you can go way down. You can actually make the cycle worse if you don't know what you're doing, if you're not careful. That's one of the risks of stabilization policy. So you got to do it. You got to have the right size, and you have to have the right timing, because timing is an issue. There are lags. Now, with the money supply, the benefit of changing the money supply is you can do it immediately. Okay, the Federal Reserve can act immediately, like they did the stock crash of '87. They immediately started buying bonds, lowering that interest rate, assuring everybody that they'd have plenty of liquidity. Any banks that needed liquidity, they'd have it there for them. So it was that assurance that really did it. But if you're trying to stimulate the economy through money supply only, monetary policy, that does take a while to ripple through. The benefit is you can implement it immediately, but there's a longer lag before investment really takes place and that sort of thing. So implement immediately, longer lag. However, fiscal policy, once it's implemented, it can take effect quicker. The problem is getting it implemented. Okay, what do they have to do? What do you have to do to increase government spending, to lower taxes? Oh my goodness. You've got all kinds of political battles. You've got politicians trying to put all their pet projects into the budget. If government spending is going to increase, you're going to want all kinds of things in there that you're going to take home the bacon to your people at home. You know, the people who elected you. So so every politician is trying to put a bunch of pork in there. We've seen that. We've seen debates about that recently. Lots of battles trying to inflate the bill with stuff that has nothing to do with it. Okay, so you've got that problem. And then you've got politicians getting on TV, calling each other names and telling them how awful they are and the things that they won't support, that makes them this or that, and they're horrible. I won't use the names. You know what names they are. Constantly used to get their way, to get their pet spending. So, and the same with tax changes. Oh my goodness. You're going to be calling people names and all kinds of things because they want a tax cut for this group or that group, or they want a tax increase for this group or that group, or this group isn't getting benefited enough, and you've got all kinds of that going on. You cannot. The problem with fiscal policy is that it's hard to, there's a significant lag. So you're going along here, let's say you're going along here, and you recognize here that we've got to do something, okay? So you start putting together a spending package, a tax cut, whatever. We're going on, it's being debated. In the meantime, the economy is coming back on its own. It's coming back on its own. Okay, now it's implemented. Whoa, now we're way up here. You've actually made the cycle worse. So getting the right size, getting the right timing is very difficult. It's very difficult to manage this. So that's why most economists really reserve government intervention, fiscal and monetary policy, to times that really need it, not to fine-tune it. So using our aggregate supply and demand curves, let's say here's a short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and here's a long-run aggregate supply. Here's the equilibrium price level, equilibrium output, unemployment, natural rate of output, unemployment, and so forth. Let's say aggregate demand is right there, okay? So, I mean, it's just barely, we're just barely below where we want to be. Should we use fiscal policy or monetary policy to stimulate? See? Yeah, it's not quite, but it's almost. You just want to tweak it just a little bit, just a little bit. Oh boy, the temptation. But unless you get it just right, you may overshoot it and be out here, okay? And then you slow it down. You come back, you're back here. Oops, speed it up. Now we're back here. Oops, slow it down. We're back here. See, we can make it worse. So in cases like this, it's probably best for them to just keep their hands off. But if you're a good politician, can you really afford that? Let's say we're going along at 2% growth right at the moment, and we want it to be 3. Okay? We want it to be 3. And you're going back to get reelected. Okay? You've got a campaign going. What's your opponent going to do? Your opponent's going to beat you over the head with this. Hey, we're barely going along. Look at that. And he says we don't need to do anything. He's a do-nothing. He's a do-nothing. He isn't willing to help the American people. We're going at 2%, and he says that's fine because it's more risky to stimulate the economy. He says that we're going to overstimulate if the economy is coming back on its own and it's most prudent. Okay, that's what an economist would say. That guy's going to get beat. Oh, I want the guy who's going to go in there and fight for me. I want the guy that goes in there going to fix this economy. Right? So this is where politics gets mixed into this. So the economics, wise economics would probably say, don't do anything there. You're as likely to screw it up as you are to help. Maybe more likely. But a politician says, I can't afford to not do anything. I have to do something. I won't get reelected. So there you go. You're wondering why our budget is out of control. You're wondering why the debt is so high and keeps growing. Well, wonder no longer. Right now, lots of spending being debated. Okay, we do need relief. People need to be helped. But as far as a stimulus, actual economic stimulus, no. The only stimulus we need is a coronavirus cure. Once we get this cured, and hopefully this vaccine will do it, the economy will be just fine. This is not an economic sickness. This sickness is an actual sickness. So once we get this coronavirus under control, people can get back to work. It's not going to. The only government intervention we need here, we've already gotten. We've got expedited. We've got greatly expedited vaccine, regulations for new vaccines. Normally, this would take years. They got rid of all those regulations and they got it expedited. Now it's just a matter of getting it out. That's where government performed a great service. They expedited it. But as far as any economic stimulus, well, that's going to take care of itself when the vaccine starts to take effect. However, that's where politicians come in. Do you get to take credit if you don't have a stimulus? Not really. But you got to have a stimulus if you want to take credit. So there we go. Politics, debt, and more debt. Okay, gang, that is it for fiscal policy. And well, let's see. I'm glancing at my notes. I think I've got the gist of it. The problem is the size and timing, and it's a severe challenge. That's why, well, you saw in the video that economists were debating whether the stimulus spending of President Obama, if it really did anything. So the ability to manage aggregate demand is not, we can't manage like we would wish we could. A lot of politicians would have you believe it's like steering a ship, and as long as they're at the helm, everything will be well. But reality is a little different. It's a little more difficult to manage that and fine-tune, especially fine-tune. But when we have a disaster like the financial crisis, that takes fast government action. Like the stock crash in '87, that takes fast. That requires quick government action, no doubt about it, both on the monetary side and the fiscal side. In the Great Depression, well, like I said before, the Federal Reserve gets an F there. But 20/20 hindsight, they didn't know. They just didn't know then what we know now. Okay, fiscal policy is in the books. It's been a long one, but that does it. Finally.